Thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Gavin Cleespies, and I am the Director of Programs, Exhibitions, and Community Partnerships for the Massachusetts Historical Society. I would like to extend a special welcome to anyone who might be attending a virtual MHS program for the first time. Considering the size of the virtual crowd this evening and the fact that we have people registered from all across the country, I'm sure that some people on this call are interacting with MHS for the first time. If you're not familiar with the Massachusetts Historical Society, we are the oldest historical society in America. We were founded in 1791 and have been an independent nonprofit institution dedicated to collecting, preserving, and publishing and sharing our state and our nation's history for the past 229 years. In these days of social distancing, we have taken to hosting virtual events, and we have online events planned for every week through June. Our next program is this Friday at 2 o'clock, and we are hosting author Tom Whalen, who will join us to speak about his new book, Kooks and Degenerates on Ice, Bobby Orr and the Big Bad Bruins and the Stanley Cup Championship that transformed hockey. Today, we have a great program exploring a very relevant topic, the influenza pandemic of 1918 and how it impacted voting. Our speaker this evening is MHS's own Peter Drummey, who is the Stephen T. Riley Librarian at the Massachusetts Historical Society. The format of the program is that Peter will start with a brief introduction. We will then open the session up for some questions of fact, just to help clarify the setting that we've established. Peter will then give the main part of his presentation, and he will open it up for questions again. So without further ado, I am going to turn it over to Peter Drummey, who can begin telling us about this program.
Let me just say that what I intend to do is not present myself through this hour, but take you through a slideshow to give some, put some faces on names that I'm going to refer to, and also give you a feeling of what 1918 looked like, both in terms of the influenza epidemic and the events taking place, especially here in Massachusetts and Boston. The Massachusetts Historical Society is located here in Boston. We're focusing on that, but I'm going to extend this to cover a larger part of the country. And because Gavin is controlling the slideshow, I'm going to ask him to show the next slide and maybe do that now. The central figure in the story at the national level is Woodrow Wilson, who made this bold statement in the spring of 1918 that politics is adjourned. That is, that in the height of the war effort during the First World War, there was no room for partisan politics. And what I'm going to describe is how that played out over the summer and through the fall of 1918 up to the election, the national election on November 5th, 1918, and how, in fact, politics was not adjourned, that partisan politics played an important role, of course, in the outcome of the election, perhaps concealed in some respects by language and appeals to patriotism, but nevertheless was at work, and how political scientists since 1918 have tried to parse the role that the influenza epidemic played in the outcome of the elections. Now, at the national level, it's the case that there was a very close election, but a very consequential election, where the Republican Party won back control of both the House of Representatives and, by a very narrow margin, the Senate. And Massachusetts is anomalous in that where this trend towards the Republican Party was taking place nationally, there is one outlying election here in Massachusetts, the election of David Walsh to the United States Senate. And that's what we'll be focusing on as we discuss this, the national trend essentially towards the Republican Party, and at least in one election here, the election of young Democratic senatorial candidate. In fact, the head of the Republican State Party chairman here in Massachusetts in the aftermath of this election described the defeat as the greatest calamity that has befallen the party in Massachusetts history. Now, that's probably an exaggeration, but I suspect at the very same moment in the aftermath of the election that people around Woodrow Wilson were trying to cast this defeat, especially this narrow defeat in the Senate, in the most positive terms. But even with a narrow victory, by the Republican Party, it had really very substantial consequences for what followed. So if you can show the next slide. We're going to start by talking briefly about the arrival of the influenza. We tend to call this, as we think of people then calling it, the Spanish influenza, although it certainly didn't come here to America from Spain. In fact, in most accounts today, certainly here in Massachusetts, they're still using a term from French, the grippe. That is the idea that this caught you by the throat, it suffocated you. An apt description of what happened during the influenza. But this is where the epidemic started here in Boston on Commonwealth Pier in Boston Harbor, a place where ships and troops sailed for France. It was also called the receiving ship, not a ship, but simply a naval base. And it's at the end of August in 1918 that the first cases of influenza here in Boston are brought to the attention of medical authorities. And the influenza very quickly, very rapidly, as it does everywhere where people are infected, spreads through the very large number of naval personnel training and stationed here in Boston. So this is a classic epidemic that goes from a small number of cases exponentially expanding over a matter of just a few days. And the next slide. Probably the most famous instance of this is at an Army training base, Camp Devens, north and west of Boston. This is, people fell in love with panoramic photography at this time. And this is a very large, very quickly erected base where tens of thousands of troops are in training in the summer and fall of 1918. This is simply the base hospital, which seemed appropriate in size, set up to house thousands of sick soldiers, but in a matter of just a few days, overwhelmed, where perhaps 15,000 of 45,000 troops were infected, and hundreds of soldiers quickly died from influenza. This is almost always from pneumonias caused by the influenza. But very dramatic outbreaks within the military and naval population here in Massachusetts, and quickly followed by widespread infection of the dense urban areas in Massachusetts, but essentially over a matter of just a few weeks, first the entire state, the entire region, and very quickly over the entire country. I point to these military instances first because it's understood that this is one of the important factors, the vectors in the spread of this disease. There are hundreds of thousands, perhaps more than 1 million troops in training and large, densely populated bases all over the United States, but being rapidly moved from one base to the other as bases open up, as specialized training takes place, and especially in the time just after the crisis of the First World War in the spring of 1918, the movement of large number of soldiers overseas to reinforce American soldiers in France who are going into very heavy combat for the first time. And so this influenza is spread through the United States by rapid transportation, by trains, and then moves quickly to Europe, and then back from Europe to the United States again. The influenza epidemic, and the next slide, Gavin. Oh, gone a little bit ahead. But the influenza epidemic also has to be understood as coming in waves. These are all things we're talking about today, but there was an outbreak of influenza that people now think was connected with the great influenza of the fall of 1918 and the spring of 1918. Many people sick, but not without the sort of lethal nature of the influenza that returned or grew in the fall of 1918. And then on top of this, on top of the outbreak and widespread of influenza, essentially through the period leading right up to the election of 1918, there's also one of the dramatic Liberty Loan drives takes place, starting late in September and continuing on into October, really at the height of the influenza epidemic in the United States. There are mass rallies, this enormous enthusiasm, patriotic enthusiasm for raising money for the war effort, even in a country where this epidemic is raging. The Liberty Loan is essentially oversubscribed. They set out to raise $6 billion, which is an enormous amount of money in 1918, and raise almost $7 billion. There are parades everywhere. Very few cities, even as they try to control the influenza epidemic, are able to resist the public displays and parades associated with the bond drives. There also, it's essentially a hiatus in the pre-election campaign season. That is, during the period of the Liberty Loan drive, from the end of September through October, there's very little political campaigning. It seemed to be inappropriate for partisan political campaigning to take place during the time of this patriotic effort. Woodrow Wilson himself marches in a Liberty Loan parade. There are people who take advantage of this. Al Smith, who's running for governor in New York, campaigning for governor in New York in 1918, complains that in upstate New York, where he's trying to garner support, every town that he goes to, and these are mostly Republican bastions that he's trying to work upon, suddenly finds that it's necessary to have an embargo on public meetings just as he's about to appear. But this is all taking place at the same time as the Liberty Loan drive. In the next slide, this very dramatic patriotic poster by Joseph Pinnell. Pinnell, because this was a poster was lithographed, he thought, and he was very popular at the time, he thought that we have to think of a country plastered with these this patriotic material and these posters. He thought as many as 1 million copies of this image may have been lithographed in the fall of 1918. It has this apocalyptic vision of what will happen to the United States if we don't all help out in the war effort. I don't think it's easy to see, perhaps, but in the right hand of the poster in front of the collapsing Statue of Liberty, there's a German submarine entering New York Harbor. The planes bombarding overhead, that's on the level of impossibility at that time. Nevertheless, the war came home to America late in the summer of 1918 when long-range German submarines approached the coast of the United States, including standing off New York Harbor and attacking ships. A submarine and attempting to bombard barges off of Cape Cod in Massachusetts fired some shots that went over its target and landed on the beach in Orleans on Cape Cod in Massachusetts. This has been called the Battle of Orleans. This was shelling by mistake, but it's the only time there was actually an attack on US soil during the First World War. But it meant that when we think about how people perhaps didn't pay the attention to the very deadly influenza epidemic that was taking place, we have to remember that this was during wartime. Sometimes people argue that the censorship prevented this news from traveling. I don't think it was so much censorship. The newspapers are full of news about the influenza. Nevertheless, in the hyper-patriotism of this period, there's an inclination to put the most positive spin on any news like this. So almost from the first time the epidemic breaks out in American cities, there's stories that describe how the effects are lessening almost immediately. The epidemic was very deadly, but very rapid. So the great influenza, it's called, really took place and starting here in Massachusetts and spreading elsewhere very quickly through the United States in a matter of 6 or 8 weeks in the fall. The height of it was a matter of 6 or 8 weeks in the fall of 1918, which overlapped not only the federal election in November, but the primary elections here in Massachusetts held at the end of September. And here in Boston, there are city elections that took place early in December of 1918. So all these elections here in Massachusetts and in Boston took place during the course of the influenza epidemic. And the next slide. I should say a little bit about the attempts to deal with this crisis. And a person who deserves a great deal of credit is the then governor of Massachusetts, Samuel McCall, who, a Republican, but a man of independent thought, who had a very energetically organized the Committee on Public Safety, the apparatus to deal with problems during the First World War, is famous here in Massachusetts for having arranged relief after the Halifax explosion, an explosion in Halifax Harbor in Canada at the end of 1917, where relief efforts from Massachusetts, a relief train left Boston 8 hours after news came here. In addition to in a reflection of this hyper-patriotism of the period of the First World War, at least perhaps not in the broad public, but it's certainly in the branches of government, there had been a great deal of effort devoted to preparedness. This helped certainly in 1918, having the system set up. The misfortune of Massachusetts in being the first place to have a large-scale outbreak of the epidemic, in some respects, was balanced by the fact that Massachusetts was one of the few places, because of the early onset of the epidemic, that it was possible to call in medical and other aid from elsewhere, including from Canada. I think there was some feeling that we were in this war effort together, and also this was in fact return for the efforts on behalf of relieving the aftermath of the Halifax disaster the year before. But McCall was an adept, very energetic governor, threw himself into this effort, also asked for national aid, Republican, but turning to the Wilson administration for additional aid. The New England National Guard, the Massachusetts National Guard, were almost to a man serving in France at this time, but there had been a home guard, the Massachusetts Guard, formed. So as this epidemic spread, these home guard soldiers, essentially a militia, volunteer militia, set up tent field hospitals, essentially next to large hospitals in many cities and towns throughout Massachusetts. Automobiles were assembled together, and drivers at a time when there were few automobiles and few chauffeurs, as they were called, drivers, to quickly transport doctors and nurses from place to place and supplies. This effort was really heroic, but completely overwhelmed by the scale of suffering during this time. And the next slide. One really important part of the story is the role played by the American Red Cross, which was playing a quasi-governmental role already in recruiting nurses and volunteers for war work, but organized in a way that I think is difficult for us to imagine today. There's, by some accounts, maybe a third of all Americans, including children, were participating in some level of Red Cross effort. One of the real problems here in Massachusetts is the military had essentially devised a system of hospitals to ship overseas by cloning large civilian hospitals here in Boston, Massachusetts General Hospital, Boston City Hospital, and the hospitals affiliated with Harvard University had all assembled members of their staff to serve as the base for forming base hospitals to send to France. So that at the time of this crisis, Massachusetts was deprived, here in the Boston area especially, of many of its most skilled physicians and a great deal of its nursing staff. So it was left to volunteers to come forward and both provide nursing care and also the material necessary to deal with the epidemic. This is the time when the gauze mask first appeared everywhere. There are questions about how much use these masks were, but there was an attempt to provide essentially everyone with them. And here you have Red Cross volunteers who had probably been, up until this time, assembling surgical dressings, turning their effort to making gauze masks. And next. Here in Boston, there are people who are active in the national political scene. This is Henry Cabot Lodge, the senior senator from Massachusetts, who is, at this time, before the election, the minority leader of the United States Senate, a long-term member of the Senate. Lodge was a very powerful figure in Massachusetts politics. It's also the case that he and his good personal friend, probably best friend, even though they had divided in 1912 over the path of the Republican Party, by 1917 and 18, Lodge but his very good friend Theodore Roosevelt were devoting almost their entire energy to attacking Woodrow Wilson under the guise of trying to aid in supporting the war effort. I think they were sincere in thinking that Wilson was wrong-headed and their criticisms were correct. But this probably Lodge represented President Wilson's greatest political opponent at this time, and the bitterness, the venom they directed at each other, or Roosevelt and Lodge directed towards Wilson, is really breathtaking, reflected in Roosevelt and Lodge's personal correspondence lies here at the Massachusetts Historical Society, and Wilson's remarks along the same lines from the opposite side of the hill, so to speak. But Lodge is both a national figure in politics and also very concerned about the outcome of elections here in Massachusetts. And next. The junior senator from Massachusetts is John Wingate Weeks, who's been described as looking like the epitome of the Republican businessman. He was a banker who had served in Congress and then was the last person to serve in the Senate from Massachusetts who had been appointed by the legislature, the Republican-dominated legislature, rather than winning popular election. That was back in 1913. So he's running for re-election in 1918 and is running in a popular election for the first time. It's important to remember this is still, here in Massachusetts, a restricted vote. Women are participating in elections, but here in Massachusetts, but only voting in school elections at the town and city level, so playing no part in the national election in 1918. In the West, most of the states in the West, the far West, and New York, women vote in 1918. And there's, just as what the effect of influenza is, there are, of course, questions about what the effect of women on a small scale being able to vote in 1918 might have been in the outcome of the election. So Weeks is running for re-election, and next slide. The what's complicating his run for re-election is that because the legislature, really the state of Massachusetts, largely dominated by Republicans by a wide margin, sort of the reverse of present day Massachusetts, dominated by the Democratic Party. Nevertheless, there are factions within the Republican Party, and where I think it's fair to describe Weeks as John Weeks is representing the conservative part of the Republican Party of Massachusetts, but he has a bitter opponent within his own party in Samuel McCall, the governor. McCall had, like Weeks, had a long service in the House of Representatives and had vied for the election by the legislature back in 1912 and lost a very close election in the legislature 2 weeks. And there was a great deal of bitterness about that. McCall is conservative, but has progressive ideas about a range of topics. His perhaps at the independent end of the scale of Republicans, progressives and progressive Republicans had played an important role in Massachusetts politics. So that within the Republican Party, there's this tension, but McCall steps aside so that Weeks can run uncontested in the to be nominated for re-election. But then it's left to Weeks to run as a popular election for the first time since he was in the House of Representatives, while McCall has been won and lost very close elections as governor. This is a time of annual elections, so the governor, the state officers are running every year. So has campaigned and won election 3 years in a row during this period. But he steps aside to make way for Weeks to run in the 1918 election for the Senate. And next, the Democratic Party candidate for the Senate from Massachusetts is this man, David Walsh, former governor, someone who had defeated McCall and then been defeated by McCall in these annual campaigns for governor. In 1916, had passed on the opportunity to run against Henry Cabot Lodge for the other Senate seat, made way for John F. Fitzgerald, a great character in Massachusetts politics, to run against Lodge. That had been a very close election, Lodge versus Fitzgerald in 1916, but Lodge, who had not run in a popular election since the 19th century, had served in the Senate for a long time, nevertheless was able to refurbish himself as a popular candidate, at least to the extent of defeating a very strong opponent. But in 1918, Walsh returns from a temporary retirement from public life to run as the Democratic Party candidate. And next, I'm just gonna stop here. I've covered a lot of ground, tried to do it very quickly. So what I'd like to do is find out if there are any questions about, to clarify any of these points before we go on, because there have quite a bit more to cover. And we're gonna have a time for questions at the end of the program. But just before tell you how this election comes out at both the national and the local level, and then say something about perhaps what the role is or isn't, both at the national level and the state level, having an election during an epidemic. Want to make sure that there's nothing I've said that's confused people or want more information about.
Okay, thank you, Peter. We do have a couple questions that were typed in while you were speaking. One was La Grippe recognized as a seasonal infection before the 1918 pandemic?
That's a great question and really important one. Yes, that there. In fact, this was so much part of kind of annual life, and this is before antibiotics. So there's very little that can be done about pneumonia that comes often as an after effect of the influenza. So until 1918, the health department here in Massachusetts doesn't keep track of influenza as contagious disease because I suspect they thought of it as more endemic than epidemic, that is simply naturally recurring. One thing that's really important, and the annually recurring influenza is also very dangerous because one of the confusions that arises is that often you'll see two figures. the total number of deaths in the United States from the great influenza of 1918, given as 675,000. And other sources, you'll see that as 550,000. Experts are using exactly the same information, but the people who use the lower figure are, what they're describing is the difference between the annual death rate from influenza and pneumonia, more than 100,000, subtracting that from the death total from 1918, 1919. So that's how substantial that is. And there had been previous terrible epidemics, one in the 1880s, but no one had ever experienced anything like what happened starting in the fall of 1918 and extending on into the spring of.
Is there of the influenza having originated in Kansas, as has been reported in some places?
That's a really great question. I'm giving myself away here, but I've often thought, because we say Spanish influenza, maybe we should say Kansas influenza or American influenza. The first recorded cases are near Camp Funston. It's now part of Fort Riley, which is one of these great training bases in Kansas, much like Camp Devens here in Massachusetts. These are spread all over the country. This is influenza, the start of an influenza epidemic back in the early spring of 1918, where many, many soldiers and other people got sick, but with a brief, violent attack of influenza, perhaps a different in scale number, but not so different in the number, in the effects from the annual influenza. One interesting artifact of it that makes people think that it's a weak wave of what came as a virulent wave later on in the year is that people exposed to this first wave of influenza in the spring of 1918, both here in the United States and in Europe, seem to have contracted the severe influenza at a much lower rate, so had built up, people believe, built up some sort of natural immunity. A lot of people think that this, what you're seeing at Camp Funston and in the area around of Kansas around it is first report rather than originating place. Many scientists think that this influenza is another of these avian influenzas coming from probably Asia. And this, what you're seeing is first reporting rather than place of origin. But that's one of the really interesting, many questions still remain about 1918 and the influenza. It's a terrible to say, but I think that it's hard to believe now people aren't going to go back again and look more closely at this story. And that's one of the real outstanding questions.
Another question was there evidence of a tension between state responses and national responses in 1918? And how much did the national government really respond to local outbreaks?
Well, that's another great question, because the U.S. Public Health Service had only just got started as being an important enterprise. It had existed before, but with very narrow treatment of quarantine sailors and a very narrow and specific port authority responsibility. But it started taking on more national role. There was a scientific and medical revolution underway, the development of vaccines, modern medical techniques coming into play. But the U.S. Public Health Service played a fairly minor role. One thing that they did do is they circulated information about how to deal with influenza widely. So often the pronouncements you see published by local boards of health and health commissioners are in fact the head of the Public Health Service his information being passed on through. But this is essentially state by state, locality by locality enterprise of fighting against the influenza. There's a lot of distribution and exchange of information, much of it not very useful or false, but nevertheless, this is much more dealt with in 48 different states and in the territories as well, on a different scale in each place.
Okay, so just being conscious of the time, if you want to finish the rest of your presentation, we can move on. Would you like to go back to the slideshow?
Yes, why don't we do that? And we'll have time at the end for any questions that people have. Want to talk about what happened here in Massachusetts in the election, and what happened nationally, and where we can find evidence of the effect of the epidemic on elections. While at the national level, I should have said before, the 1916 election had been very close. President Wilson was reelected by the narrowest of margins. Even before Truman, Wilson went to bed not knowing how the election had gone in California and not knowing whether he was president or not. The Senate remained in had a Democratic, this is in 1960, had a Democratic majority. The House of Representatives was evenly divided, the most remarkable outcome of an election where there were the same number of Democrats and Republican members of the House, and 5 members, prohibitionists, progressives, and a socialist, held the balance of power in the House of Representatives. In 1918, the election went relatively heavily towards the Republicans. They won the House of Representatives by a considerable margin. They won a narrow majority in the Senate by 2 votes. There are a lot of elections, a lot of seats that change hands, but the total outcome puts the party by a narrow margin in the hands of the Republicans, which of course means that Henry Cabot Lodge is no longer the minority leader. He's the majority leader of the Senate. And he's also becomes the chair of the Foreign Relations Committee, which has profound implications for what follows. But here in Massachusetts, because we're always trending somewhat differently, David Walsh is elected to the Senate. This is what the kind of bright place in this rather desolate circumstance for the Democratic Party. Not by a wide margin, but nevertheless defeats John Weeks, and in spite of, and this seems hard for us to think of, is one of the in the last days of the election when there really were some sharp blows exchanged, this period of political truce came to an end. One of the accusations against Walsh, who was still quite a young man, is that he was a draft dodger. Technically, I think he was still less than 45, so he was subject to the draft that had been expanded in this war and emergency. But nevertheless, he's been a governor, so he's not a new face, but nevertheless has won this popular election for the Senate. And other than that, Massachusetts remained a very Republican state. In fact, the Republican dominance of the state legislature increased at this time. But if we go ahead to the next slide, here's his opponent. The vote is slightly more than 200,000 votes for Walsh and 188,000 votes for Weeks, who it's hard to say how much of this election was moving towards Walsh and how much of it was moving away from Weeks. And if we go to the next slide, oh, this is, and I know this may be hard to read, but because one of the things that people argue is because of the ban on public meetings that took place as the election approached, although here in Massachusetts, most of these bans had been lifted before the election. Nevertheless, it meant that a lot more campaign literature circulated. And this is from my eye, a very sharp distinction drawn between the campaign platform of Walsh, which was sort of as an independently leaning Democrat, and Weeks, who was very much part of the political establishment, and criticizing him for one thing, voting against or the idea of popular election of senators. He was, even though the Republican Party had, as a party, was supporting women's suffrage, Weeks voted against it. And most of these, his stands as a candidate running for popular election seemed out of tune with the electorate, at least here. But if we go ahead one further slide. Oh, there's a very interesting, and this is certainly Massachusetts because all politics is local. There's a third independent candidate in the election. So I said that that Walsh beat Weeks by about 20,000 votes, but this man, Thomas Lawson, as an independent candidate, received more than 20,000 votes, so that many people think that he wrecked Weeks's chances. Now that is assuming that all of the people who voted for Lawson, the third party candidate, would have been voted for Weeks in the election. But nevertheless, it is the case that that this had a remarkable effect in the election. One of the things about Lawson is that he was a true rogue. He was had acquired an enormous fortune by investing in the stock market, but is a person who was sort of proud to say that you would never make an investment without having inside information about how things stood and what you were going to invest in. Attempted to secure monopolies. He made most of his money in the kind of copper mining, steel making business, made and lost fortunes. But one of the things that people were well aware of is he had I won't get this right, but had a daughter who married one of Governor McCall's sons, so that Governor McCall, the old opponent of Senator Weeks from elections past, people said, well, this is the politics of revenge, that McCall got his revenge over Weeks by having this relative by marriage sort of stand in as a third party candidate. I think that this seems like too much of a coincidence to not have an element of it. But it presupposes that every vote that Lawson received would have gone to Weeks. But this is what makes this so complicated. And if we go on, one of the things that's really wonderful here in Massachusetts is point out that even at this time where everything's closed, because of the Internet Archive and Google Books, we have access to an enormous amount of material from the time of the election. So here in Massachusetts, you can follow the results down to the precinct level in terms of how things were how votes were counted. So see this town by town and within cities, precinct by precinct, and analyze this vote. So let's just go on. Things that happened very rapidly after this election and after the height of the pandemic that make it kind of become, people talk about the pandemic being forgotten. And I think we'll talk about the consequences of the election, but not be familiar with the details of it, is the election on November 5th was followed just a few days later by, on November 11th, the Armistice. And this had, this sort of overshadowed all of the immediate results of the election. Nevertheless, it had, people credit it with a resurgence of the influenza, these large public celebrations everywhere. I think that there's probably, if there's any element of this, what really happens is as the epidemic it is no longer as deadly as it goes on, as it essentially many people become sick and then recover and build up this sort of herd immunity. It is the case that large public events bring people together again. But the end of this, the United States has only been in the First World War for about 18 months, but a world war that had lasted 4.5 years, it's not surprising that was celebrated in with large-scale public events. But there are people who say that this is part of the resurgence of the epidemic at the end of 1918 and on through the early months of 1919. And at the same time, just to give you some sense of the scale of this, and this is going back to my point about this underlying annual influenza, and then this great increase of mortality and sickness caused by the great influenza. I resist calling it the Spanish influenza, and calling it the grip now seems like something of an affectation. But in Boston alone, probably by mid-October of 1918, 3,500 people have died. By the end of 1918, probably 4,500 Bostonians have died. And by the end of the influenza season, the spring of 1919, approximately 6,000 people have died. Boston had essentially the same population that it has today. Massachusetts had a population of about 4 million, something towards 2/3 of the modern day population of Massachusetts. And then again, depending on these calculations, 28,000 people dying in Massachusetts. Maybe if we subtract people who die annually from influenza and pneumonia, it's certainly more than 20,000 additional deaths. The scale of this is really staggering. And throughout the country, this is a time where the United States has a population of only a little more than 100 million. The idea of whether it's 550,000 or 675,000 people dying, it's still an extraordinary scale. I just want to point out, let's go to the next slide. And I promise we're at the end. I just want to point out that at the end of this, I've sort of lured you all here to hear that there's really not much that we can demonstrate that the influenza affects the overall election, tilts the election in one way or the other. It's certainly the case that the vote in 1918 is considerably decreased, maybe by as much nationally as 20%. It's the case that in the 1914 and 1916 elections, about 50% of the people eligible to vote voted, and in the 1918 election, it was only about 40%. We do have to take into account that many people, of course, are sick or afraid to vote. But at the same time, there are more than 4 million people serving in the armed forces, many people away from home working in war industries, so that here in Massachusetts, where 200,000 men serve in the armed forces, there's a natural reason for that suppression of the number of votes. Absentee voting had only come to Massachusetts the previous year in 1917. They called it absent voting, which I don't know exactly what that's supposed to mean, but really only was for people who were either away from home, they were really thinking about soldiers serving elsewhere, or people who had a religious scruple about the voting, which in the specific election, it's not clear what that would be. But there is almost no absentee voting by soldiers serving either here in the United States or overseas, at least here in Massachusetts. That becomes it had been very important at the time of the Civil War, and it would become important again at the time of the Second World War. But here in Massachusetts, where absentee votes are separately recorded, it's only a tiny number of people who vote absentee. They're able to, technically, but hasn't come into being yet. One of the things I wanted to do is just talk for a moment of what followed. That is that by the spring of 1919, this great time of danger had passed, and Massachusetts had some of its largest public events take place. The Yankee Division, that is the New England National Guard, not simply people from Boston or Massachusetts, returned from France. They were some of the first troops overseas, but as veteran troops, they were kept in Europe to enforce the Armistice when there was some question about whether warfare would resume again. So it didn't come back until months after the war ended. And perhaps the largest public event in Boston history is the Great Parade when the Yankee Division returns. This enormous public outpouring. And it's interesting to think about how different that time was, and the fact this took place really right at the end of this enormous epidemic, this largest public event. There also, and this is where at the national level, the election had profound influence because there was in the treaty to formally end the First World War, this movement towards world peace, towards a League of Nations. And early in the spring of 1919, there was a public debate here in Boston, held at Symphony Hall here in Boston, where Henry Cabot Lodge debated the president of Harvard over whether the United States should enter the League of Nations and under what circumstances. And even with standing room, this is soon after the end of an epidemic, standing room audience, there were several thousand people at Symphony Hall. But in fact, 70,000 people, these were not just people from Boston, but maybe going towards 10% of the population of Boston, applied to get tickets for that debate. So that there was this idea of public activity was not seriously affected by the trauma of the epidemic, that a younger, perhaps more resilient population was prepared to move on. So what I thought would do is stop and answer for a few minutes anyone's questions, and then would just end with what we might take forward from this. There's a lot else to cover in terms of this, but just to think about, answer anybody's questions, specific or general, that I can, and then maybe reflect just for a minute or two on what this might mean as we think about an election coming up a few months from now.
Thank you, Peter. So we do have some questions here, and I think some of them you may have already covered. But let's see. Is there, they said, voter turnout, any sense of whether the impact of the pandemic had uneven demographic impact in Boston or in Massachusetts broadly? Socioeconomic, ethnic groups, urban versus more rural communities?
No, actually, that's a really interesting point. There's a wonderful community study for Norwood, Massachusetts, about the effect of the influenza there. This was a fairly big industrial town in 1918, and one of the author makes a really interesting point that that the epidemic has a broad effect. But in fact, it's poor people who live in densely built up parts of a community who have less access to medical care, who suffer the most in the epidemic. Massachusetts at this time has probably its largest percentage of foreign-born members of the population. Well, today it again has a very large number, but this is at sort of before the immigration restrictions that take place after the First World War go into effect, a very large foreign-born population, and it's understood that that population, which is affected greatly by the epidemic, disproportionately by the epidemic, is underrepresented in voters, even people who have been here for a time or have been naturalized, who theoretically could vote. And of course, many recent immigrants could not yet vote. But so that's not seen as being directly connected to it. It's also the case that I think it was really quite dramatic is how some of the places hardest hit by the epidemic, Boston is certainly one, but large industrial cities and towns in Massachusetts have higher rates of infection and death, but that doesn't seem to have affected their vote disproportionately. One thing that I should point out that I haven't, and this is just as brief as possible aside, is that there had been reform to the Massachusetts Constitution. So in addition to the voting for candidates in 1918, citizens of Massachusetts who could vote were also voting on 19 ballot questions, almost all amendments to the Massachusetts Constitution. The most important one, I&R, initiative and referendum, that is democratizing the ability of citizens to get laws or amendments of the Constitution enacted over the resistance of the legislature. That was fundamentally important in this election. Just as an example, this was a constitutional convention that took place over years, then put amendments that had passed the convention before the electorate. That's how absentee voting had come in 1917. The I&R, the initiative and referendum, very important and very closely fought amendment was on the ballot in 1918 and important. So there were other things than that. And of course, that idea of democratizing participation in government was appealing in the working class, large industrial cities and towns in Massachusetts.
So there's a person named Jerry who's raised his hand, so I'm going to allow him to talk. So Jerry, you may need to unmute yourself, but you're welcome to ask a question.
Can you hear me? I think I did.
Yep.
You had talked a moment ago that there was not a disproportionate effect on ethnic groups, et cetera. However, I understand that the 1918 epidemic affected almost exclusively young people, rather the opposite of what we have today. And I was curious as to whether today older people tend to vote in a higher proportion, and I was wondering if that was the case back then or if you had a more even distribution. and how the age impact of the epidemic might have influenced the result?
That's a great question, and something I didn't touch upon, but it is the case. This is probably not as well understood as it should be. This is not that that all the people who got sick and died were young adults. What it was is that the typical annual influenza mortality is associated with extreme youth, babies and infants, and then with people of substantial age. The mortality curve is like a U. The mortality, when you mark out a graph of the mortality in 1918, 1919, what you see is something that looks like a W. You still see a high rate of fatality among the very young, and you see this relatively high, but perhaps less rate of mortality among the older population. But in the middle of it, you see a spike of deaths among young adults. Not an overwhelming, well, they represent a very large portion of the population. So the spike is also represented in the total number of deaths, when the entire population, of course, is much younger than this today. Probably half the population is less than 20 at that time. So you're seeing something that's quite different. There are many theories why this takes place. It's I think that if it's also that same population, at least the male part of that population, are the people most likely to be in military service. So they're both out of the voting cohort because they're away in the war, millions of them, and they're also people who are overrepresented in the number of sick and dying. As many soldiers die of disease in the First World War as die in battle or from wounds in battle. This is a kind of demographic catastrophe. The life expectancy of Americans goes down in 1918. And one of the things that, again, it's got just one more point, is this continues, not in terms of the election, but it continues in terms of if 1918 is the most dangerous influenza year of the 20th century, it's probably the case that 1919 is the second most dangerous year. So this is much more long-lived, even though the results are very dramatic early in the fall of 1918. The extent of this extends over months and months throughout the country. There are two elections that people that can really point to. One, a local election out of which comes an important legal case in Idaho, where two people vying for judgeship in a probate court essentially tie a number of votes they get. But there's a quarantine school in this voting district, where an emergency voting place has been set up so that the quarantine staff can vote. And with an election that's decided by 5 votes, even a small number of votes shifts the results. And this is fought out in the Idaho Supreme Court, and it has every bit of drama. But the winning candidate, it essentially comes out as a tie after these votes of the quarantined school staff are put aside, and comes down to judges scrutinizing individual paper ballots. Sounds familiar to us, I think, to determine the outcome. But that's really the only legal case about all of the real substantial legal case that grows out of this attempt by localities and states to deal with election results. There's also, and this is one of Woodrow Wilson's most bitter opponents, Albert Fall of New Mexico, people suggest that the reason he was reelected, he was one of the first senators from New Mexico, but running for popular election in 1918. And he had lost both a daughter and son during the epidemic. And there's this feeling that the sympathy people felt towards someone who had suffered this terrible loss sort of shifted the result of that specific election. But across the country and here in Massachusetts, hard to see the specific way that, other than a reduction, perhaps some additional reduction on top of the reduction in the number of votes, directly connected with the epidemic.
Okay, thank you. And I think we should be conscious of people's time. So maybe we can do one last question, and then you had a final comment. Max wrote in, was there a substantial clarion call of nativism regarding the outbreak of influenza in Massachusetts from elected officials or others?
Nativism? Actually, this is really interesting because while the two things that you kind of look for, I mean, there's argument made in this study of Norwood that I can't recommend too highly, although it may be hard to get. This is a recent book, so I don't know that this is going to be easy to get a hold of. I'll give you the citation of it, or I can send it to anyone who's interested. One of the things is there doesn't seem to be, while almost everyone is saying the influenza came from somewhere else, I don't think it's directed, an animus directed directly at any ethnic group or any outsiders necessarily, other than outsiders of communities that feel besieged. The prejudice in directed at people that essentially blamed for the calamities that fell upon them seems to be more general than specifically animus on nativist lines. No, it's a striking thing that probably poor people and immigrants and African Americans suffered more from the consequences of this, but don't see much evidence, at least I haven't, and here in Massachusetts, of animus directed along nativist lines, especially in a place really interesting because it was so steeped in that, and here was so steeped in those feelings in the 19th century. I just want to close with two things. One is that it's far too much to go ahead in, but this election, this very close run election, had a profound influence in what happened thereafter, in the sense of the Republican control, even by this narrow margin of the Senate, meant that you could probably say that a strong American role in the League of Nations was essentially doomed at the end of the day of the election, in the sense that there was strong resistance within members of the Republican Party and as a platform, not exclusively Republicans, against this. The shining hope of Massachusetts electing a Democratic senator offsetting this loss is somewhat confounded when a year later, David Walsh, erstwhile Democrat, joins Henry Cabot Lodge, the senior senator from Massachusetts, in opposing the League of Nations. This is along kind of complicated lines, but it essentially has to do with the idea that the League of Nations, one of the ideas is it would prevent intrusion in the internal workings of any independent country. And I think someone like Walsh, the child of immigrants, the child of the oppressed in another land, as he described it, saw that there was no way to aid moves towards Irish independence if the United States was taking part in this sort of larger control over the circumstances of places elsewhere in the world. And as an anti-imperialist, he had very strong feelings about that. And the big powers were definitely going to take the major roles in this. So this is one of these quirks, is even the election here offered no long-term solace to the direction President Wilson was moving. There are some things that I think we can look at, and I'll just mention two of them. One is it's very hard to look at the events, not just the election, but the other events of 1918 and 1919. And even with the very limited, what we would call social distancing that took place then, the closing of theaters and public events and church services and schools, things that are all familiar with us. Businesses, for the most part, remained open. So this is a limited kind of constraint on people interacting. But to be fair to them, they had a limited idea of how this disease was being spread exactly. Some of the brochures and broadsides that we have, including some at our website that refer to 1918, most of it's very familiar to things that we tell people to do in public, and then a couple of them, people, in addition to all the things that we know about masking and keeping a distance and trying to wash and be clean and go to bed if you're not feeling well, and essentially self-isolation. There are two of them here in Massachusetts that I sort of like is you weren't supposed to do any forceful talking, that is vehement talking, sort of discharging things, or forceful laughing. Those two things were recommended against as well. But I think we can look back at this and see the spread of the influenza in 1918 and really think very hard about how important long-term quarantine. The quarantines in Massachusetts were 5 days, and then a week, and then 2 weeks, and then 3 weeks, and then a month. But essentially, and as soon as things reopened, people were all actively exchanging out together again immediately. At the same time, the other part of it makes us quite different from them. I'll end with this was a country full of young people with a much small, mature people, certainly threatened by this disease, but where a young country, essentially perhaps not more resistant to catching disease and suffering from it. In fact, the information makes it clear that young people were vulnerable, even more vulnerable perhaps, but people who were resilient, people who immediately after the end of this returned to a life that was essentially normal, or in a kind of strange way, maybe compensated for these restrictions on movement and activity by being more enthusiastic about celebrations and more active in the immediate aftermath of that, of what they saw as the danger period, often with tragic consequences. There ends my sermon.
Just as this program comes to a conclusion, I would like to point out that the Massachusetts Historical Society is currently collecting stories of people's COVID-19 experiences. This is prominently featured on our website, so if you visit masshist.org, you will be able to find it. If you want to go directly there, it's masshist.org/project/COVID, which will bring you there. And finally, I just wanted to thank everyone for joining us and let them know that we are still an independent nonprofit and are supported by membership contributions. I know this is a very difficult time for many people, so we're happy to offer all of our programs for free. But if there's anyone who does have the financial ability to support an institution like the Massachusetts Historical Society, we would deeply appreciate it. So I hope everyone has a great evening, and I'll just thank them for joining us now.